Reading a little viewer mail at the top of the hour here. We had an email from David L. Carter quite some time ago in response to our question about what's a good song to go with Till We Have Faces. He said, by the way, the song that sums up Till We Have Faces best for me is Kate Bush's Running Up That Hill.
If only could, I'd make a deal with God, and I'd get him to swap our places. Be running up that road, be running up that hill, be running up that building.
I replied to him and I said I should listen to more Kate Bush. Then he sent me a link to Running Up That Hill on YouTube. And this, by the way, was in January of this past year. I had the treat of getting Running Up That Hill by Kate Bush stuck in my head just a few months before it was stuck in everybody else's head. And now it's still stuck in my head. It doesn't hurt me.
You want to feel how it feels?
If only could, I'd make a deal with God, and I'd get him to swap our places. Be running up that road, be running up that hill, be running up that building. If only could.
I was pointing out last time that the Christian life is simply a process of having your natural self changed into a Christ self.
So welcome you all to a very special bonus episode of Inklings Variety Hour, where we have the original crew back together.
What?
Meagan Logston and Anika Smith. How are you all doing?
So glad to see your beautiful faces. So excited to have Meagan back.
Yay, I'm excited to be back and geek out about stuff with y'all.
Yeah, so we were just texting each other about Stranger Things. We figured, so few people are talking about Stranger Things. We should really make a podcast about it. I bet there's no other podcast about Stranger Things out there. They always say
of podcasts.
Yeah, just like Lewis and Tolkien, they couldn't find books out there that were about the stuff that they liked. They wrote their own books about that stuff. We're going to do that. We're going to blaze a trail and talk about Stranger Things and maybe find some connections to some of the Inklings' work and maybe some other connections with things.
Yeah. I will say the Kate Bush song, as soon as I'd heard it a few times before. It's been on KEXP for years. It's obviously very catchy and gets in your head, but I never really listened to the lyrics. And then watching Stranger Things and hearing If Only I Could, I'd make a deal with God and I'd get him to swap our places, be run up that road, run up that hill. I was like, oh my gosh, this is Charles Williams. This is substitutionary love. How have we never discussed this in Descent into Hell? This is like the doppelganger meeting. Yeah,
also that line, the let's exchange the experience. Yeah, very much about that like web of exchange, substitutionary love. Even though I'm sure she did not have Charles Williams in the back of her head when she wrote that. But
of course she did.
Who knows? Maybe she did. I don't know. I don't know if Kate Bush.
They're both British. It could be.
They are both British. So, and as we all know, all British people know all of the other British people, obviously.
That's
right.
That's right.
It's a very small island.
It's a mind hive. It's much like the Upside Down.
It's a mind hive.
Or hive mind.
Hive mind,
There we go. I like mind hive. Let's use that.
I do like mind hive. Trending. Let's get it trending.
Yeah. I'm doing what my daughter does. Adriana constantly postposes adjectives. So for a long time, she was saying poop dog instead of dog poop.
I really like poop dog. Wow.
So she thought it was really funny. So she is a real ham. So she just got a lot of mileage out of yelling like, poop dog. Since this is, at least in theory, an Inklings podcast, what are some connections to the works of the Inklings? I guess is just a question to start out, and then we will probably veer off in different directions. What are some other connections that you all saw, not just necessarily with the Kate Bush song, but with other things?
They make obvious references to Tolkien,
I say you're asking me to follow you into Mordor, which, if I'm totally straight with you, I think it's a really bad idea. But the Shire, The Shire is burning. So Mordor it is.
So they make obvious Tolkien references, which are probably there also because they are clearly influenced by D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, which is influenced by Tolkien. So therefore you get Tolkien influence anyway. I mean, again, like the general themes that are present in, I think, all of the Inklings works of like good versus evil, light versus dark. It's cliche as it sounds to say, but the power of love and friendship wins the day, you know? So all of those are present. If you want me to jump straight into into Charles Williams waters, we can go.
Jump in.
Dive deep.
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, there were a couple of things that seem very Williamsian in watching Stranger Things, but one of them was the whole, before we go any further, I was going to say, if you have not watched Stranger Things, please do not keep listening to this podcast and go watch it. I am going to be spoiling plot details as we go forward. So it's rare for people to tell you to turn off a podcast, but please do. If you have not watched Stranger Things, go watch Stranger Things.
Also, if you're sensitive to horror, you may not want to.
If it's not your thing, that's fine.
Feel free to listen to what we say. You won't know what we're talking about half the time, but yeah,
that's true too. It's a little bit dark. I would argue it's more like horror light than it is like there are horror elements in the show because there's a lot of like it balances it well with like humor and stuff like that.
Meagan, what were you saying about like Williamsian aspects to?
Oh yeah, one of the things, just the idea of Vecna / Henry / one as a type of Wentworth figure, almost obviously in a more fantastical and supernatural sense because he's a dark wizard or whatever, and Wentworth is not. Just the idea that Vecna basically refuses to participate in the community of humanity, like which is also kind of it's a pretty standard dark wizard trope anyway, to be like, I'm above everybody else, you all are terrible and worthless and you just deserve to die and all of that stuff. But for me, it sort of hit those Williams notes of this idea of self-isolating. He's like, I'm different, therefore I'm going to go live in my own little world. I thought about the line from Descent into Hell in that great chapter where he basically lays out his entire substitutionary love framework. And because Pauline asks, do you think I can basically push my burdens onto other people? And Stanhope replies with a great line that says, not if you insist on making a universe for yourself. And that line's always stuck in my mind. It's amazing because he's illustrating that too by what Wentworth is doing in the novel. He's making a universe for himself. He's got fake Adela, and all of that. For me, when I see, a big bad like Vecna being like, I'm going to remake this entire world in my image, basically, is what he wants. He's trying to get the Upside Down to take over Hawkins, first Hawkins and then the world kind of thing. And so for me, that kind of evokes that idea of, I don't want anybody else living in this world that I'm making. I want it all to look like me and just be for me. And I don't care about living in a society of people who are actors that are acting upon each other, carrying burdens and all of that. I was thinking, because he was even doing it in the flashback about him as a boy, he was even then isolating, like he found the spiders in the floorboards. He was like, I just want to be a predator. So even before he gets, defeated, quote unquote, by 11 and sent into the Upside Down, he's already showing those tendencies of self-isolation. And that ultimately is his downfall, as it is for Wentworth as well. Yeah. So that was kind of the main thing that stuck out to me. The other thing that was very Williamsian is just the idea of the Upside Down itself. Now, to be fair, I don't know if the Duffer Brothers even know who Charles Williams is. They clearly know who Tolkien is and probably C.S. Lewis, but I don't know if they know who Charles Williams is. And they're more influenced. The more obvious influence for the Upside Down is there's a concept in D&D of the Underdark. And so that's kind of where they got that. The Underdark is where all of the, super, super evil, and nasty things like mind flayers live and stuff like that. So that's the obvious influence. But for me, it was less the idea of like, oh, there's a secret, evil realm out there that wants to take over and destroy us all. but more just the idea of there being another deeper reality that underlies the one that we see, and that at any point real reality could break through into ours. Because that's basically sums up Charles Williams' novels in a nutshell. Oh, look, the reality, capital R, broke through into our world either through a magical object or just people.
I mean, that's the place of the lion too, of the true things are becoming even more real and breaking in. Yes.
Yeah. So while like the parallels aren't perfect, because Williams is obviously referencing like a divine reality, the upside down is very clearly just, oh no, we have to stop this from breaking through because it will destroy us all. This other reality that affects us even if we don't, because so many people, only a few people in the show know it even exists. The upside down, and so like all of these people in Hawkins are getting affected by it, even though they have no clue that it exists.
Yes. So as a charismatic evangelical, I was really surprised this season of Stranger Things with how much the correspondence of actions people took and the ways it opened them to the upside down, right? And that corresponding reality of experiencing trauma and then having openness to the darkness, right? Like that wounding being a bridge to being exploited by dark forces. That's so like something we're actually taught and trained in healing prayer and deliverance ministries of these are wounds that need healing in order to break off demonic forces. Sorry for those who are not woo-woo in their spirituality. But like that to me was actually really astonishing and helpful in the same way, like, I don't know, watching Harry Potter, I remember praying for someone and finding like the image of the Patronus really helpful. There is something real that happens when we are in despair. There is something real that happens when we are feeling hopeless. There is something real that happens when we listen to voices, and Vecna's voice especially, of you are no good, of you did this thing and you can never be forgiven. I'm like, oh, like that's straight up Satan. Like that's the accuser, right? So it's really interesting to see this materialistic portrayal, but that's acknowledging this other reality and the openness of our souls to it. I don't know.
Yeah. No, that's good. Vecna reminds me of Satan in Paradise Lost. The kind of fall and finding himself king of a new realm that's, kind of an abyss, and then molding everything to sort of, his, and even finding himself transformed. It's a very interesting parallel. And it also picks up, I think it's interesting how inspired by D&D it is, which is in turn inspired by Tolkien, particularly the parts of Tolkien, that have danger, right? And therefore deal with dark forces, right? That's especially the case in Mordor and with orcs and things like that. The sort of idea of the realm that people don't want to see is the realm that they also don't really want to acknowledge is there because it's scary. And in Christian theology, the devil's not supposed to be able to make stuff. Right? Because we believe that material, for the most part, is good. And the only way in which it becomes bad is when it becomes less the thing that it was made to be. Right? And the thing that was meant, that's like corruption. Augustinian idea of sin and stuff like that. Tolkien tries to reconcile that with his Middle Earth with varying degrees of success, right? He still has Mordor where like there's nothing good in Mordor. The enemy has managed to corrupt this whole realm. The hobbits need to go there, but there's this like kind of dangerous darkness that almost his mythos needs, right? Or that needs to be defeated. I don't know, it's interesting how that tracks both with the kind of D&D adaptations, where like there's negative creation, right? There are things that are intrinsically evil because we need to be able to swing our swords at things and kill it without feeling bad, right? But that's also an element in these more kind of dramatic strands of Christianity, right? It's this fight of good against evil, of absolute good against absolute evil, and we're flawed, but we're on the side of good, and we're fighting against those evil demons or whatever else. It's made me think, and Tolkien also makes me think about the ways that we picture evil. Do we need evil in order to feel like we were accomplishing something, in this sort of grand epic kind of way?
Such an interesting question. Do we need evil? I don't know that I've ever heard anybody phrase it that way.
I mean, I don't think, like, theologically, I don't think we do need, obviously we'll all be
right.
redeemed and go to heaven and there will be no evil and everything else, but I just mean, like, currently, psychologically, it seems to be something that we need.
I mean, if we're talking about, like you said, sort of Hollywood dramatizations of good versus evil, especially in the fantasy realm, but also I mentioned before we started recording, like Frank Peretti's, like Piercing the Darkness in This Present Darkness.
Yes.
Yeah. Or pretty much any of his books, like the Visitation, the Oath. That's the Oath is the one with the dragon in it.
Yeah.
But yeah, like all of these, like, or even I guess more recently, like stuff by like Ted Dekker or something. It's very much like even people who are writing from a Christian perspective, they're like, here's a gospel message for you in this book or whatever. Which it's been a while since I've read any of Frank Peretti's. So I don't know all of the details of what is or isn't in there, but basically it's like, yes, he's, it's almost like a need to set up this. It is kind of like, I don't want to say wish fulfillment, but kind of, there's like a sort of an element of that of like, we do want to be these heroic people and we want to fight against the forces of darkness. And so we're going to try our best to like personify that in a way. Again, not that I'm saying like, I'm not one of those people that's like, I think that Satan is a metaphor, like, I do think that there is a reality to the demonic and Satan and all of that. It's just, I think what we're talking about is like a kind of an over dramatization, or like, are we giving too much pride of place to Satan and the demons and how much power they have or don't have, and it's like, yeah.
Which is, it's so interesting because like, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest and then spent a decade in DC, and it's so materialistic, and not in the consumerist, but like in the only what you can take in with your senses is what's real, right?
Right.
And all this spiritual stuff is woo-woo, and if it works, that's fine. But we talk about it in vague things like, hey, the universe delivered something to me. I'm spiritual in that I have this sense that life has meaning, but I don't really think too much about it. And so to personify evil and to take that there's something seriously broken, and people talk about a spirit of cancer or a spirit of despair. I mean, honestly, it just in my own walk with God, it's really helpful to be like, there is someone who wants to destroy me. He is prowling around like a roaring lion, seeking to kill and steal and destroy. And he is looking at me personally, the way like Vecna does, right? Even the ring wraiths, or again, going to J.K. Rowling, which so derivative of Lewis and Tolkien, but still very helpful with, oh my gosh, now I'm going to forget their names. The little black dudes that are ring wraithy that suck
the
joy.
Dementors. The
Dementors. Thank you. Yes. This is what it's like to be chased down by fear and despair, right?
Yeah.
This is what it's like to be tempted, or to have the accuser in your ear. Like there is a spirit that is attacking you personally, and to acknowledge that is actually helpful in fighting, in turning and saying, get behind me, Satan, or turning up your music. And the use of music in Stranger Things was such a delight to me. And I saw people who were like, isn't that kind of lame? Like she can just turn on this pop song and suddenly she's protected from Vecna and he can't get at her. And isn't that really like a letdown? Like, I don't believe it. I think it's kind of a cop out that like, oh yay, if we just clap and like are with our friends, we're okay. And it's like, no, the thing that resonates so strongly with that, like this is also everywhere in Tolkien, the power of song and the power
Princess
of
and the Goblin
singing
with,
and friendship.
With Curdy.
Yes,
with Curdy and the Goblins.
Yes.
Yeah, that's how you make the goblins go away. Is you sing a song, you make up a song.
I was thinking too, because it's
more ridicule, but yeah.
Music's even in like Lewis and in William. I mean, like Aslan sings Narnia into being. In Williams, I think particularly in War in Heaven, there's like a whole passage about hearing that music and like how powerful it is, because it's like, that's the thing. I'm so glad you brought music up, because even like, yes, the show, even in seasons 1 through 3, has always used music very well, but the season 4 is where you've actually got this idea that there is like a strong healing aspect. Healing and protection aspect. Like music, yes, obviously not all music has similar effects on people, you know, but listening to it, like I know for me personally, like putting on music that I really connect with, like if I'm in a bad spot or something, putting on a song or a piece of classical music or anything like that I know like can really get deep into my brain and my soul even, is powerful in a way that talking to people about things is, yes, helpful. Obviously, I'm going into counseling, so I hope that people understand that talk therapy is helpful, but there's just something primal about music. And I think that, which is an idea that is in Tolkien and Lewis, because both of their creation stories involve music. And so it's very creative. It's very orderly. There's an order to music. If you have chaos in music, then it's not music anymore. You've lost all sense of rhythm and chord progression and all of that stuff. So yeah, I'm glad you brought up music, because it's all over the Inklings. It's all over Stranger Things. It's and so yeah, I agree with you. Like people who are saying, oh, it's kind of lame and it's like a cop out. Oh, I wanted a more complex solution to that problem. It's like, but that's not a simple solution. It's the right one for this character, especially for Max, because she's going through trauma. She's experienced trauma from losing Billy, and even though like they didn't have the best relationship, but it was still traumatic. And so music is a huge part of healing from emotional and like spiritual trauma. And so I 100%, I was on board with that. I was like, yes. Thank you for putting. I loved that episode.
I mean, it's also a song about making a deal with God to get him to swap
our
places, right? Which is.
It speaks to her situation. She wishes
is,
she could have swapped places with Billy.
Yeah.
And also just the whole, because in that episode also she's vulnerable to Vecna, and so are all of the other people who are vulnerable to Vecna, specifically because I think he even has a line where he tells her, like, you know, you've shut yourself off from everybody else. That's why you are vulnerable to me, which again plays into the very Wentworthian kind of make your own universe sort of thing. Like if you cannot, we as humans, just in general, cannot exist without forming bonds. Like we are made to form bonds with other people, whether that's, not just romantic, but friendships and familial relationships, and that kind of thing. Like if you don't, then you will perish. Like that's the whole point. And which is why Vecna will ultimately lose in season 5, however that works out. Yes, the music helps her, but the music also triggers memories for the times that she spent in the past with her friends, like realizing, oh my goodness, these people were here for me and I have closed myself off from them. Like, and I don't want to do that anymore. So I am now going to run to them. And that's what she does. And so that's why that's why that scene is so powerful, because it's like that realization of, I cannot do this on my own. I cannot handle this or process this trauma myself. I have to process it in community. And so she goes to find her community.
And that's that same recall that's at work in Tolkien when Sam is singing in Mordor, and he's singing about Baron Luthien, and Frodo hears him and is saved. Like they are connected, they are saved. The fact that Tolkien uses songs so much in battle. I mean, even the Silmarillion, I think Feanor, someone sings before going up against Sauron, right? Like it's part of battle songs going back to the Nordic sagas and the Eddas. Singing is its own magic. Like the word for spell casting, going back to also D&D, is the same for singing, right? And singing forth, pronouncing, you are singing, you are calling into this other realm by the act of your physical and creative choice to do this thing. And I love that it's so present in the show. And I feel like that's also another sort of recall in a really surprising way, in a materialistic, technocratic thing, and that where the plot lines seem to fall short for me, like some of the stuff with Harper. Right, like the crazy Russia stuff.
Listen, every time they cut back to Russia, I would be like, oh man, I was really into the kids. What's happening to Steve? He's my favorite. Go back to Steve.
Well, adults are not as cute.
No, they're
as,
not. They're really
as
not.
kids.
But no, I was actually talking to my roommate about that. It's like every time they would like cut to a shot of like a plane or the snow, it was kind of jarring. I'd be like, wait, what is this? And I'm like, oh yeah, that's right, Russia. That's happening.
No, it's funny actually, because my wife, at least when we were watching it, well, at first we were kind of put off by that, but by the end, that was one of her favorite parts, and it was the part that paid off. Partly because it said so much about what it means to be a hero, and I think all three parts did to a degree. But I think you get example after example after example in the Russia arc of people who probably shouldn't be heroes and find some sort of heroism, you know, and are inspired to risk their life for, you know, something greater than themselves, whether it's Mother Russia or whether it's something else. That was kind of a neat aspect of that.
Yeah, it definitely, the Russia stuff picked up for me like once Joyce and Murray got there.
Yeah.
It was all the stuff leading up to it that I was like, oh, more Russia stuff. But then like once we got
so
to the part
cold.
I know basically you're like, oh good, another scene about how it's cold and the food is terrible. Okay. And also some occasional torture by the KGB. Okay, KGB. But yeah, no, I felt the same way. But I do agree that like they tied it in very well. And also, I don't know if you were aware of this, but that there's an Easter egg in there. The sword that he picks up to kill the Demigorgon with is from Conan.
Conan, what is best in life? To crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentation of your women.
Wow.
Right.
Kevin Sorbo?
No. That's he was Hercules. Conan, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Arnold,
Okay.
but Conan the Barbarian was Arnold Schwarzenegger. So that was apparently his sword that they threw in there.
Wow.
Very cool.
Yeah, lots of 80s references. Yeah.
What else did the show have to say about what it takes to be a hero, and how does that gel with different things in, I don't know, either Tolkien or Lewis or whatever else?
So are we going to talk about Eddie?
Prissy, this is from you.
Yeah, let's talk about Eddie.
As we talk about heroes, and we're not heroes, right? Like look at us. We are not the heroes.
We're not heroes. Yeah.
And he's going in. He begins as someone who I hated him like the first couple episodes. I don't know about all y'all. I also tend to judge drug dealers though, so that's on me. I really enjoyed his arc.
Yep.
The fact that he begins, and again we realize there are lots of spoilers here. That he has to see that first really terrible death, and you can tell he's so freaked out. But that trauma is not limited to that single instance, but he also sees the second bridge, right? He sees the guy who's coming out to murder him from the basketball team. Also, Vecna gets him, and he sees that same torture and terrible death and is powerless. Just completely powerless. And so for him to then go into the darkness and not just be the distraction, but to have a chance to give his life and to have the self-sacrifice, I found it redemptive on the level of like Boromir at the end of the Fellowship of the Ring. I know there are some who think his death was in vain on this podcast, so I think you should chime in and tell me where I'm wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I don't quite understand. It's possible I just wasn't paying close enough attention, but I don't quite understand why he needed to die, why he went back through that crack. And
well, he didn't go back through. He never went, because Dustin had gotten through the crack.
Yes.
And then Eddie had looked up to see Dustin, and that's when he made the decision to protect Dustin, to lead the bats away from them. I took it as he was worried that all the bats were going to fly through into the real world and get Dustin. And he didn't want that because he has a bond with Dustin. And so he's like, I'm going to lead these bats away from here. I'm going to be bait again, twice, and keep them distracted so that they don't go through the hole.
Because he cuts off also the way back for
the
Dustin,
way out.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's possible. I don't know. It's possible they just didn't make that clear enough that there was still a threat from the bats once they'd gone back into the real world. Because I did not feel like Dustin was still threatened after he'd made it through that crack and maybe.
I mean, isn't that the point of Vecna's bridges? Is that stuff is breaking out into?
Yeah,
Hawkins?
conceptually, but if it's like an actual present threat, they would dramatize it a little bit, right? Like they'd have like a bat like peeking through the hole or something like that, and have Eddie be like, "Right, it's I better go back there. You stay here, Dustin," or I better, or like the bat like starts to fly through and Dustin like yanks it back. Eddie yanks it back, right?
Yeah.
I didn't quite like. I thought he was going back through to fight the bats because he didn't think they'd bought them enough time or something like that, right?
I mean, it could be that too, because I mean, they at that point, I don't think that they didn't know for sure. Oh, the other team, Nancy, Steve, and Robin are in the house fighting Vecna. I don't think they even knew that at that point.
Right. Yeah. Which like to me makes it kind of like there was no sign to him that.
But there couldn't have been.
There yet.
Right. There couldn't have been.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you want to talk in terms of possibilities, what's actually possible? I mean, they could. I mean, like what I'm saying is they could have dramatized it better so that his sacrifice was more clearly vital to the success of the mission. Because it didn't feel vital to me.
Here's the very Tolkien tie-in. When they send off Frodo and Sam to Mordor, everything they do to draw the Eye of Sauron away, and they don't know what's happened to Frodo. They don't know if he's been captured. Right. They don't know anything, because once you send them off, they're cut off, right?
That's right.
Away from sight. Gandalf can't see. No one can see.
Yep.
And so every step you take from there on out is just on faith.
Yep.
That, okay, I trust something's happening with this mission, and my job is doomed. Like, I'm going to die, but I'm going to go march to the gate of Mordor and take my last stand, because just like there is a chance, right, that Frodo and Sam have made it, and I need to give them as much time as I possibly can.
Yeah.
Yep.
Like that part where Frodo and Sam play Metallica on the...
Obey your master.
Which was
so good.
It was most metal ever, right?
Yes.
Okay, so the whole time, this entire season, I'm like, oh, now they're going for the heavy metal stuff with the 80s, right? Like everything about the Upside Down suddenly looks like an album cover or something, but it looks like the album cover of Meatloaf's "Bat Out of Hell."
Like a bat out of hell, I'll be gone when the morning comes. But when the night is over, like a bat out of hell, I'll be gone, gone, gone. But like a bat out of hell, I'll be gone when the morning comes. But when the day is
They never come
played.
They never play Meatloaf.
Never come through.
You wanted Meatloaf instead.
I wanted Meatloaf.
Yeah, Metallica instead.
Yes.
Wasn't that the Separate Ways remix at the end of the penultimate episode amazing? Came on and I was like, I don't know if I'm ready for the last episode, guys. I just, because at that point I was thinking, who's gonna die? Everybody's gonna die. They're all dead, and it was very dramatic. So
it's never a good sign in a show or a movie when they tell you every step of their plan.
Right.
But I thought what was really brilliant about this is, I mean, it doesn't work if they telegraph everything that they're going to do to the audience and there are no surprises, and then everything is pulled off perfecting and everything goes well. Like that's not how you do a story. But what they did that was really interesting was it did all work more or less according to plan. There was a little hiccup with Jason, right?
Which didn't you want to punch him in the face? I mean, I'm not like a violent person, but like my roommate and I were talking about that. We're just like, I hate it. It's a trope, and I recognize that it's a trope, but I hate it every time in a movie or a TV show where like a character comes in, they're misunderstanding a situation. The other character knows what's going on, and they're like, "Hey, no, let me explain." And guys, "No, I'm not going to listen to you." And instead, I'm going to, stop this from happening, and I'm not going to listen. And it's like, stop it. Just everybody sit down and have a conversation about like, let him explain what's going on. Like instead of making assumptions.
Let's bookmark that, because I think we should talk about popular kids and what they have in this movie, and we should also talk about Satanic Panic, because to me both things were a little bit overwrought, but I think it's worth coming back to. But yeah, what they did was they made everything work. It still didn't work. Right, which is really like everything did go according to plan except for that hiccup again, but like that didn't really affect the outcome. It's just not all the stuff that they did wasn't enough, which is really interesting. But I haven't seen that because I was thinking the whole time, oh, it's totally not going to go to plan, but it went to plan. It just wasn't good enough, which was kind of cool. All right, popular kids. Let's talk about popular kids. And let's talk about Jason, who we all wanted to punch.
We all wanted to punch him.
And I felt like I wanted to punch him, but I also like recognized and was perhaps more resentful that I was being manipulated into wanting to punch him.
Yeah.
Because
it was totally unfair.
Yeah.
There can be good football heroes, guys.
Yeah. And there are so many. What part of what they're doing is they're tapping into this 80s trope, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Which is the cool jock
rich
people, rich people, like in Dirty Dancing and Heathers,
Goonies.
And Goonies. It's this preppy type of guy, and they want the girl, but it's really the like loner loser guy who's got the real heart, and they should get the girl.
Isn't Steve the repudiation of that, right?
Yes,
and the redemption of it, which is why he's so great.
Yes.
Yeah.
He just has an amazing arc. Like from season one, he is that kid where it's like, I'm the popular dude. I bully people.
But you still like him. Like he still has charisma, and you're like, oh, I see his appeal.
Yeah.
Whereas
because there is that point in that season where he realizes, oh my gosh, like actually that was a terrible thing of me to say. I'm going to go apologize to Nancy, or to Nancy and Jonathan.
Yeah.
And that at that point is when the plot tries to eat him. Well, and he survives, which is great.
Well, I heard that they were planning on getting rid of him.
They were going to kill him off.
Having him be a jerk, and then he was so dang charismatic.
So
and
they were like, we got to keep him.
that they put another twist in his kind of arc. But
that's amazing.
But they didn't do that with Jason. That's the kind of person that becomes popular, is the kind of person who has charisma.
Yes.
And is fun to be around,
Yep.
right?
Yes.
So in real life, Steve and all these kids, they would be popular.
Yes.
And Jason, who is not, he's charismatic as like a villain, right? But like you don't like hang out with that guy. Yeah, I don't know.
You don't want to join his team.
I still think the movie that gets high school spot on correct is Napoleon Dynamite.
Yes.
Because they nail that the like snobby kids are really just as unpopular as anybody else. They just think they're popular. They're honestly like kind of lame and stupid too. It's funny. There's this whole thing in the 80s about the popular kids versus the nerds versus like just the kind of kids who were in the middle. It might
like
have been
the band geeks.
Yeah.
And
I feel like it was probably real in the 60s when the people who made those movies were kids. It never rang true for me or most of the people that I knew that they're and when it did, it was like that thing from Hollywood was being imposed on your high school experience, right? It's really odd. And also like the thing in California when they're
I was just going to mention that whole thing. But like because to an extent, like yes, it is over dramatized probably, but I think stereotypes are often based in truth. Bullying is the thing that happens in high schools. Does it happen to that extent? Does the basketball team whip the town into a frenzy in a satanic panic kind of inspired speech? Not necessarily, no. Maybe they do if lots of people have been murdered horrifically in your town. That's it's like there is an element of truth present, that there is, yes, at least maybe back in the 80s, 90s, maybe the uncool kids or the weirdos, or the outcasts. There was an element of that, like, oh, I don't fit in with these people and they treat me differently because I don't fit in. Like, it works in context of the show because the show is set in the 80s. And I think like now I would have more of a problem with like a modern day show set now, pulling out those kinds of tropes, because I think I don't know, I don't work in a high school or a middle school, so I'm not, I don't have like boots on the ground experience here, but I would question whether those specific, especially not the stereotype of, oh no, those weird nerds over there play D&D, they're weird and we're going to ostracise them, because now D&D is super popular. So you don't have that element of it. But I think, to your point, I agree that it is like over dramatized, but it's a TV show. So that's kind of what they do.
Yeah. They make 80s pop culture into 80s reality, right? I still think 80s pop culture, it's mostly John Hughes drawing on his life as a high school reject or whatever happened to him in the 60s. I don't know. It must have been bad.
Poor John Hughes.
Yeah.
And a little bit of Spielberg. I mean, I feel like there's so many Spielberg callbacks in Stranger Things, but that's more the nostalgic, like really sweet stuff in the underdog, and less focus on the bullying, except as like feckless villains, right? Like in Goonies, they're the guys who end up being tricked by everyone and pulling up the bucket instead of pulling up Andy, right?
Yeah. Is there any equivalent of evil popular people in any of the Inklings works that you can think of?
The beginning of the Silver Chair. Is it Jill? Jill's the one getting bullied, right?
That's right. Yeah.
They're talking about the popular
Experiment
girl.
House.
Yeah.
But they didn't seem like popular girls. They just seemed like really mean British kids.
but Lewis,
which is a whole stereotype unto itself, right?
Right.
Lewis is drawing on his experience, though, his horrific experiences at boarding school for that. So there were definitely like the popular kids who were good at sports, and the adults mostly were like, why aren't you like them? Because they're really team players and they're great at sports, and Lewis wrote this whole epic called Loki Unbound about, and it doesn't survive, but it was about Loki standing up to Thor and evil popular people like that. So absolutely.
Yeah. I do feel like that hideous strength is a good callback, in that there are these people who tell you they're doing everything for the right reasons. They're the technocrats and the experts. In the same way, it's always like, oh, it's this government program, and it turns out the government is trying to kill Elle or kill people in Hawkins who know what's going on, but who, because of their own knowledge and their own authority, think that they then have the right to rule and to kill with impunity and control. And that feels the experiments, everything about Elle's life before she escapes seems very NICE-ish. And that's
all the rainbow room stuff.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. And Papa, man, Papa. Yeah.
Take it from us too soon.
Oh man.
He is a complex character, guys.
He is.
It's hard. It really is hard to get a read on him, which obviously is, I'm sure, intentional on the Duffer Brothers' part. But it's because it's like there are moments where you go, oh, he is very fatherly toward Elle, and he does care about her. He wants what's best for her. That's what he's saying. And then there are other times where you go, what are you doing? Why are you mistreating her? I think what it is, it's like, I don't agree with your definition of what's best for Elle. Part of his own hubris is that he thinks, I'm a man of science. Which again is where you get the NICE parallels. It's like, I'm a man of science, so I'm going to figure this out, even though you're exhibiting these powers that we actually really don't understand, but we're going to study you and we're going to learn how to turn you into a weapon, basically. But that's for your own good, trust me, And it's like, I don't know that I agree with that. And it takes it takes her escaping and meeting like Mike and the rest of the kids to realize, oh, actually this relationship that I just left with this man is not healthy.
Yeah. No,
So,
it's definitely not healthy. I think what makes him slightly more sympathetic and more complex than the NICE is that it comes, at least in his case, it seems like from a sense of urgency. That the world is doomed if I don't like yes, this is a little girl, and yes, I am not treating her the way a child should be treated, but according to his calculus, if he doesn't, the world will end, right? Whereas with the NICE, they're just like, this is just the way things are going, we need to keep up with progress and do things, in well, I mean, the next stage of evolution, blah blah blah.
Wasn't the NICE also driven by the same fake but very present in the mind of intellectual elites in the mid-20th century of like overpopulation, like we're going to run out of resources, we need science to tell us how to manage our society in order to prevent total collapse and chaos. And I think that hubris comes out for Papa. I mean, the fact that Papa, that he ran this program with these little children, that he kept one on after like this person tried to kill people and said, no, I know how to control. I have this mechanism. I have this way of doing things. I know how to limit, and I am smart enough and good enough on my own to manage this human being or manage this evil or to capture it, and then is overwhelmed by the supernatural forces and the evil unleashed. And that feels very NICE, like the expertise that is just completely destroyed by forces that were too dark for it, that it didn't know what it was messing with.
I mean, he's kind of a Denethor figure, right? Except instead of completely despairing, he just is like, well, maybe if I do this some more, it will save us, this horrible thing. He's interesting. I appreciated that it made him more complex without necessarily just making him into a good guy.
Or redemptive, right, right.
I was kind of afraid that's where they were going to go with it. And then, I agree with you. It would have made him entirely less interesting at that point. Because at that, you're kind of expecting that. You're almost, I guess, because we're primed to think that, okay, well, this guy seems like a bad guy, but it looks like he genuinely cares about Elle. And so maybe he'll come over to the side of, oh my gosh, what's Paul Reiser's character's name?
I just called him Paul Reiser the whole time.
All I see is Paul Reiser.
Paul Reiser.
The second he came on screen in season 2, I was like, oh my goodness, that guy. Also, hey, more Tolkien parallels. Sean Astin is in season 2. So there you go.
That's right.
Oh, Bob. Bless you, Bob.
And Goonies.
And
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So I agree with you. I think if they had given him some kind of a super corny redemption arc, it would have lessened the impact of that character. So because I think the other reason that he's there is that, I mean, that whole death scene with him dying and then him basically begging at that point Elle to be like, please tell me what I did was right, forgive me, and she basically refuses to do that. That's part of her arc. And so to realize, no, I recognize here that what I went through under you was traumatic. It was trauma. It altered me. You think you're doing the right thing, but you were not. I've decided that you were actually not treating me the way that I needed to be treated as a human being.
Well, and it was a lie, right? And she's not going to assent to his lie that it was all for her good. Everything I did for you. No.
Right. Yeah.
No.
Right. No, it wasn't. Yeah. Yeah. It was actually now you can put noble reasons on it. Like Chris said, he realizes that there's a crack in the world. We got to fix it. There's something evil coming through. I know about Vecna. I know all about that, but here's the thing about that is that even though there is a line, Vecna has a line at the end where he basically tells Elle, no, Papa didn't make me, you did. I mean, Papa, even before the whole stuff with one and opening a gate to the upside down, even before all that, he was already doing weird experiments on children, probably, what was it? It was government sanctioned, basically make assassins to go fight the Russians kind of thing. I don't know. So it's he's already involved in some shady, sketchy, morally gray stuff anyway. So it's not like it was a case of, I was a really great upstanding guy before Elle came along and then, the world got torn asunder. And now because I have to fix the world, I'm going to have to do some things that I actually don't want to do. It's it's very clear that he is fine with taking the actions that he took. I think he still can sleep at night, basically. The show didn't give me the impression that he like was tormented by the fact that he had to do what he did to the children and all of that. So I'm glad that he did not get a redemption arc. He did not need one.
I thought it would have been interesting to have him have a redemption arc simply because his type so rarely gets one nowadays. It seems like there is a kind of, there's this trope of a oppressive patriarch, if you will, you know, who has had things run their way for too long and has taken liberties, and the end game is to shut them down, right? And they are pure evil and purely bad. And I thought what was interesting about this is they at least gave a little nuance to that and showed that, like, by his lights, he does have some sort of a moral framework where the ends justify these means. Obviously, with like the particular things that he was actually doing in this show, no, you can't have somebody come back from that. That's not ever okay, right? But in terms of his type and in terms of what he sort of represents, I think, especially in modern entertainment and things.
I mean,
like
calling
that.
him Papa.
Yeah, exactly. It would have been interesting to see how he, or like other like typical, like Jason, could have had a arc that brings them back to what's good. But you do have Steve and you do have Hopper, right?
I was going to say,
is definitely a father.
Hopper's the stand-in, yeah. Like it's he's almost the replacement Papa. He's the image of what Papa should have been. I mean, minus the scientific madman genius, you know, or whatever. But like, because he does start out, his arc is, which I thought was a brilliant scene in season 4 with him explaining the whole Vietnam backstory and Agent Orange and how that affected his daughter and losing his daughter. He's coming out of this place of, I had a daughter and I lost her. And I feel like that's my fault because I shouldn't have even tried to have children because I knew that I got exposed to this Agent Orange in Vietnam.
And because I participated in this war crime.
Right.
I mean,
right, exactly. Right. And so he's dealing with all of that guilt. He turns into an alcoholic. Like, yes, he's the police chief in season 1 and season 2 and all of that. But like,
he's the alcoholic with a drug addiction.
Yes, with drug addiction. Yeah. That's how he numbs that pain.
Does he do drugs? I didn't realize.
Yeah. Do you remember that in season 1?
Yeah, I forgot.
I know he was popping pills. Okay.
I don't think they ever have a scene with him like contemplating suicide or anything like that. But I mean, he was probably borderline at some point. But that's how he has to numb the pain. But then he comes to realize through getting involved with these kids, having to go rescue Will out of the Upside Down, and just going through all of that, and then adopting Elle as his daughter, because season 2 is the one where he's super overprotective and will not let her leave the cabin, and they have fights about that. But that's his like, hey, it's not so much I'm a mean dad, it's hey, that's coming out of my place of trauma of like, I lost my daughter and I do not want to lose you too, so you are going to stay in these walls where you're going to be safe. He has to come to realize that no, Elle is not like a replacement for his daughter or anything. She's her own person and is probably the only person who could stop what's going on with the Upside Down. And so that's like his arc. And I think that's kind of meant to be a foil to Papa, where like Papa's very much like, I know what I'm doing. Nobody can tell me otherwise. Like, I'm smart scientist man. And and Hopper is like, I know nothing. I'm just trying to figure out what's going on here. This is all weird. So in a weird way, he has more, even though he's very like, you know, gung-ho and very active and brash and
very macho.
Yes, very macho. But in a weird way, he has way more humility to recognize that he's in over his head and he's trying to figure out what's going on here. And so I think that makes him a better father figure to Elle in the end, because he's more open to being told, oh, I don't understand something, and here's new information that I didn't have before. So now let's put all that together and solve this new problem that's come up, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think this also tracks with 80s movies where it's funny because, like, you have a kind of sense of who you sympathize with in the 80s movies in high school are the nerds, right?
Yeah.
Are the experts, right? Who are getting picked on by guys who are probably a little bit like the way Hopper was when he was in high school, right? But also in 80s movies, when you get to the adult world, it sort of flips right?
Mhm.
And the government figures are all sinister,
Yes.
Yeah,
possibly
always.
former Nazis, you know,
Right.
who you can't quite discern their motives, but you know they're a lot like
Or-
Papa, right?
Or they're just dumb and feckless. Like
Yeah.
in Goonies, it's the people who are like, okay, we need to like get the kids back because they're out past their bedtime and we are powerless to stop the development from coming in and taking our homes, and we just gotta go and whatever. It's also the cluelessness of the adults too, who think they
Yeah.
know what's up.
Yep.
And so I like that Hopper's cluelessness is also yoked with his responsibility for everyone. Like he takes responsibility not just for Elle, but for Joyce, for the town, for everybody, to the point of giving his life and saying, I will take on all of this. Right. Without knowing exactly what's up and what's going to happen. And that's why it's really powerful.
So speaking of people who know what's up, should we talk about the Satanic Panic?
Yes. Yeah. Because we know it.
Absolutely should.
Let's talk about it. What did you all make of that? Well, I thought, okay, in the first season, they addressed this, right? At the very end, there's this goofy little part where they're like, also, are people getting into witchcraft and D&D? Blah, blah, blah. You know, it's this little like news teaser thing. In many ways, that rang more true for me. That kind of goofy, like, oh man, these weird extremists are, you know, getting all worked up about D&D, blah, blah, blah. For how things actually were in the 80s, than like an entire town getting scared and organizing a mob so that they could overcome evil with good by shooting people.
It's totally the one aunt. So in my family, I literally have one aunt, and because she got on a tear, we were not allowed to watch Scooby-Doo or Smurfs or like anything connected with ghosts or witches and I did grow up thinking D&D was evil. I will say that, but I also was allowed to read Narnia, so I turned out fine.
Yeah. It was interesting because I think part of what they're trying to do is retcon the 80s, and maybe I'm completely wrong, and maybe their experience was exactly like this, but my sense always was, growing up in rural Virginia in the 80s and 90s, my sense was it was the really weird Christians that were freaked out by Scooby-Doo and the Hobbit. And you know, and like, okay, we would read at our Christian school, we would read like the Secret Garden and the Hobbit, and it was like the weird family who went to our school who would make their kids sit out because the back of the book mentioned magic, right? And we were all kind of like, well, that's a little extreme, that's a little odd, you know?
Like kids who couldn't watch Disney movies because they involved witches. I was not one of those children. I definitely watched.
One of those odd people.
I watched Disney movies, but I definitely knew of kids who were like, oh no, I can't watch that. That's got witchcraft in it, you know. And so, which confused me, because I was like, even as a kid, I was like, but that's not real. Like, it's just a cartoon, but you know, people will believe, you know, interesting things.
I mean, we knew, I didn't grow up Pentecostal. I got into the charismatic movement in high school, which is a whole other thing we can talk about too. I remember the Pentecostal kids in growing up, like in a non-denominational Christian school, they were always the worst behaved kids. Like, I don't know why that was, but it I don't know that that's the case anymore, but it was when I was growing up. And we
freedom
had
in Christ, Chris.
I guess we had this friend who was awful. Like, he was probably like 9 or 10 or something like that, but he making objectifying remarks about women and like watching Beavis and Butthead and like all these like, and then I remember one time like riding with him in the car, my brother and I, and he was like, you know, there are these kids that like get together and they play this game and they actually like kill people when they're pretending to like fight these wizards and things like that. And I was like, oh, that's weird and creepy. But I don't think I trust anything you say, because you lie all the time. And I'm not saying he's representative of like all Pentecostal kids. I don't know that he ever like received the gifts of the Spirit or anything like that. But he was. I was like, yeah, I don't really believe you. Yeah, I later got in the charismatic movement. I remember talking with some people and saying like, you all really thought that like Smurfs was bad, and they're like a little bit embarrassed by it, but they some of them would double down. They'd be like, oh yeah, we didn't watch it. It was interesting because to me, as someone who's like more like just kind of mainstream low church evangelical, looking at that world, I was always kind of like, well, they don't have a ton of influence. They're
Right.
kind of fringy. But what Stranger Things did, which was really interesting, was Stranger Things made them like the mainstream of Hawkins, and not only that, but they weren't overcoming evil with good by like doing odd little rituals and walking around the town and prayer
There were
walking
no
and
shofars
things like that.
There were no shofars.
There was not a single shofar.
That was
to be
their
seen.
problem. Oh my goodness.
And but instead, like, they got a bunch of guns. The police is
No charismatic would ever
Ever do that.
That's just not. They love the same, and I think like this is something that people do. It's why we have Stranger Things, right? This idea of like evil is out there and we can go and get it and we can fight against it, right? It gives us a sense of purpose, it gives us a sense of goodness, and it means that we're accomplishing something, but the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but they're mighty through God for the pulling down of strongholds,
Yes.
right? Like,
yes. No one prayed on the full armor of God, right?
Oh yeah.
No one said like, I resist you, Satan, and you have to get behind me. No, like there was no in Jesus' name I command you.
You're talking about in Stranger Things, right?
Yes.
But in the 80s and the 90s it totally was, right?
Oh yeah.
In
our churches that was there. Yeah.
I wonder if the reason that they didn't put explicitly Pentecostal stuff in the Stranger Things is to kind of avoid any kind of controversy about like, oh my gosh, you're like attacking the Christians or whatever. And it's like,
I don't know. To me, I think it's actually a fault of it still has to have that naturalistic, like, oh, this happened because there's a human.
Yeah.
A human boy with psychic powers.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because he's so intelligent, he has these gifts, right?
Yeah.
They can do things with their minds, but it's humans doing it. There's never a spiritual force involved. And to have people actually say in Jesus' name would actually be a spiritual conflict. I mean, that would be a conflict I believe in and have seen and encountered with, but that would say, okay, this is a demon, and this is the power of Christ compels you, and this is the exorcist instead of this is
D&D.
our thing we set up. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm sure there are plenty of listeners whose experience differs from mine and from ours, and who are like, oh yeah.
I will tell you mine. Because I listed maybe y'all are either of y'all are familiar with Adventures in Odyssey, right? The focus on the family.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Everybody knows Adventures in Odyssey. Well, everybody, meaning everybody who grew up in 80s and 90s evangelical Christian, subculture. So we used to listen to Adventures in Odyssey. Like, it would come on the radio and we would listen to it. So there was one time I distinctly remember listening to this one episode. It was called Castles and Cauldrons. Obvious reference to D&D.
What? No, it's another thing.
Right. Right. No, they never call it Dungeons and Dragons. It is Castles and Cauldrons.
That's right. Just like they never pray in the name of Jesus. And
right, never.
Totally not picking on the Pentecostal Christians.
But I remember listening to the episode as like, because the episode came out in 1990. So I would have been like, when I finally heard this, I was like 4 or 5. I was born in 87. So I was more of a 90s kid, not an 80s kid. But so I remember hearing this episode, and it's basically an entire episode about how this kid's cousin comes into town for a visit. And he is like super into this like game called Castles and Cauldrons, And so he gets the main character kid to play it with him, And at first it seems like fun and innocent, right? As all things do.
It's like an MLM.
Yeah, basically. He gets suckered in. And so everything seems fine. He's like, it's kind of fun, you pretend to be like a wizard or whatever. And so it keeps getting progressively like more intense, until one night the cousin is like, we have to go out in the woods and we have to like do this thing because, it's just still pretend, but we have to like sacrifice whatever god or demon we were talking about in the game. And so at that point, so they're out camping in the woods, and Mr. Whitaker, because he has Spidey sense or Holy Spirit sense.
He's the
like,
game
oh my
master,
God.
right?
Yeah, no. Mr. Whitaker is like sitting wherever he is that night, and it's kind of storming because of course it is. And he's like, oh no, I sense that there's something wrong that's happening in the woods and I must go stop it. And so he goes out into the woods and he rescues the child and, stops the demon ritual from happening. Because clearly it was a very real demon ritual that was going on, but it was part of the game. So that was to illustrate that you don't play these role-playing games, because if you play role-playing games, you are actually summoning demons into the world. And so that was my first exposure to like the idea of Dungeons and Dragons. And so for a while I did think like, oh my gosh, I was a very impressionable child. And very sensitive. So I was just like, people do that, And here I am in my 30s playing Dungeons and Dragons. So
Mr. Whitaker would not.
I know Mr. Whitaker would not approve. But hey, I'm happy to report there's been no demon summoning or anything of that nature. So it's all been pretend. So that was my exposure. So that's the thing, is like, it was a very real thing. I can't speak to like the widespreadness of Satanic Panic. I know there were like various news stories and stuff that came out that supposedly attributed various murders and whatnot to Dungeons and Dragons. Like my roommate likes to watch a lot of crime shows, true crime shows. And so every so often you'll find an episode and they'll be like, and so played Dungeons and Dragons. And you're like, oh, is he the murderer? And it turns out, no.
Yeah.
So it was very real. And I think it was just, because that's the thing, it wasn't just limited to Dungeons and Dragons. I think a lot of people who play Dungeons and Dragons, maybe I know the Duffer brothers know that it went beyond just Dungeons and Dragons, but I think Dungeons and Dragons just happened to be the boogeyman at the right time for most people to latch onto. But it was also very much about like rock music was terrible. Various movies and such were made about how Christians shouldn't listen to rock music because it's a tool of Satan that will lead to sex, drugs, and possibly turn you gay or something. I don't know. And also just general mistrust of anything. Like there was a movie, quote unquote, of basically just two guys sitting in chairs. It's called Deception of a Generation. It came out in 1984. It's two guys sitting in chairs, and they basically just talk for like an hour about how every single piece of children's programming from the 80s is a horrible satanic conspiracy to like warp the minds of our children. And I'm talking like not just like the obvious stuff, like, oh yeah, no, that is kind of scary. Like My Little Pony, He-Man, Transformers, like all those 80s toy selling vehicles. But
I mean, it's like critical theory, but the Christian inversion applied to pop culture, right? Like
it's like everything is terrible. There's Satan is lurking behind every corner. We've got to stop him because he can use anything to corrupt our children, and that's what he's coming for. And it's just it was always interesting to me that it was pop culture.
Right.
I don't know, like it's the rock music. It's not even just rock music. Like, again, it was rock music, but like, of course, not just the obvious stuff. Like, oh, well, clearly they're talking about like heavy metal or whatever. It's
but also Amy Grant.
Yes, Amy Grant.
Yeah.
Right.
Also, I don't know if you noticed, "Dream a Little Dream of Me" had a role.
Oh, yeah.
Dream a little dream of me.
So maybe if they hadn't gotten seduced by
Ella
old-timey
Fitzgerald.
radio, Vecna would never have become Vecna.
I do have to mention, of course, the most famous example of Satanic Panic, which is the Jack Chick track, Dark Dungeon.
Yes.
So metal.
We cannot let that go without mentioning Jack Chick. So a group of nerdy filmmakers actually acquired the rights to that track and made a movie. But they're like sympathetic. They're like, they play D&D or whatever, but they made a movie dramatizing the Chick track. Like exactly. Like I think it came out in like 2014 or something. It's amazing. Yes, it's about how D&D is evil, and if you play D&D, you're actually getting sucked into a satanic cult. You'll learn how to cast like real magic or whatever. But the part of it that always gets me is the part near the end where the main character, who's still alive, she's like in church. She's sitting in church. She's like, oh my goodness, like my life's a mess. I need to figure this out because I need Jesus to fix all this. And there's like one of the panels in the track. there's like a little sidebar because the pastor is up there talking about how like you need to gather up all of your rock music and your D&D books and your occult paraphernalia and like burn it. And there's a little sidebar with a little asterisk, and it specifically says, including the works of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, because they can be found in occult bookstores.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's in there, and it just drives me up a wall every time. I'm like, because the works of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien can be found in occult bookstores, and therefore we need to burn them as well. Those don't count.
You notice he didn't say Charles Williams.
He didn't say, I know. Here's the thing. Jack Chick doesn't know who Charles Williams is.
Exactly.
No one knows who Charles Williams is. I'm sorry, Charles Williams.
I'm sure Jack Chick would have approved of Charles.
Oh, no,
Williams.
he would not have approved of Charles. If he has a problem with Lewis and Tolkien, he definitely doesn't approve of
If
Lewis.
there's anyone occult.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Probably would, if he knew who Owen Barfield was, he'd have problems with him too.
What? No. Yeah, it's such a funny American Christianity is interesting, and it has great aspects and not so great aspects. One thing that the Inklings were doing that can kind of resist some of that sort of weirdness is that they were drawing on a ton of tradition, and tradition is capacious. Right? Tradition has a kind of grace for the quirks and oddities and different giftings and interests of human beings, and asks, how can this be drawn toward what is good, right? And I think very often, much as there's a lot of good, and I think the Inklings recognize this, there's a lot of good in American evangelical church traditions. One possible problem with cutting oneself off from kind of the broader history of the church and things like that is you begin to say, oh, this particular way of interpreting our faith and of looking at things is normative and always has been for the 2,000 years that we've had Christianity. And that can lead to you being against the works of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien and banning the Smurfs and all sorts of things like that.
Poor Smurfs.
I think though, on the other side of that, I'm not quite sure how to say this, but there were people who were involved in satanic cults in the 80s, right? And who were sacrificing stuff in the 80s. And I know because like in some of the charismatic groups in the early 2000s that I was hanging out with, I knew former devil worshippers who would do stuff, and I would meet, and they would often be incredibly like, they were like Eddie Munson. They were like, I didn't fit in anywhere. This was a group that would take me, and they had weird experiences, and a lot of, and I was listening to a podcast. It's not a Christian podcast. It's like, I think it was Monster Talk or something like that. But they talked to, they interviewed somebody about the Satanic Panic, and he's like, well, yeah, like there were more cults in the 80s, and part of the draw of it was like, you're doing something countercultural, right? You're sticking it to these like fuddy-duddy old fundamentalist types. It's not that like there's any kind of necessary link between like D&D, which as far as I could tell is just a fantasy game, and devil worship or whatever else. But there were people who, what's the circle called, the graph, that like
Venn diagram.
Yeah, the Venn diagram, it can overlap sometimes, right? And bands did get a certain amount of like cool guy capital out of offending and opposing the right sort of people, right? The conservative dorky Christians, and they themselves, of course, were also dorky. So I don't, sometimes now the sort of revision of that aspect of that whole thing can get on my nerves a bit, because it's kind of like, oh, look at those Christians, they were just overreacting, and this is totally all made up just to justify them like going out with guns and rounding people up or something like that. And I'm kind of like, yeah, that's not really, I mean, maybe that was what happened to some people, and maybe our show is so widespread that I'm sure some listener out there has had the experience of getting together with the local militia to shoot up a
D&D.
But for the most part, not so much. And it's not just kind of made up from nothing. Like there were, granted, like overreaction produces overreaction, right? And
Yeah.
there were some like fairly dramatic, weird types within the charismatic church and also the evangelical movement. And you know, obviously, like Christianity is a home for everybody, right? And we got to take the weird ones too. But yeah,
I think there's also misdirection too, right? Like here's D&D, and it's this pretty innocuous game for kids and for people who, you know, keep playing into their adulthood. We welcome you.
I started playing in my adulthood, so
yes. I know a very accomplished federal judge who is a huge D&D gamer.
Can you tell us who it is?
Yes.
I
cannot. I sure as heck cannot. So D&D fairly innocuous, but like Chris, as you're talking about this, like I'm remembering, and this wasn't growing up, this was in Seattle, like there was a Wiccan bookstore on the same street as our church in downtown Seattle, and there was a coven that met in that bookstore, and they hexed our church and like weirdly found people involved in our prayer ministry and would found where they lived, chanted outside their windows at like 2 a.m, like just doing weird, really weird, and I think demonic actual rituals, right? They're like the weirdo fringe part, and then there's also that misdirection that, okay, it's this thing over here that actually isn't anything, and then undermines any credibility you have when something real happens, right?
Yeah.
And you're just like, oh no, well you're just like crazy Aunt so-and-so who didn't want me to watch the Smurfs. Instead of like, oh, you're a serious believer who just had this really weird encounter, and like, let's talk about that and pray about it and actually go at it with the tools we've been given and not with a panic.
Because even as someone who is a Christian, it's easy for me to fall into that, like, oh, why does everybody overreact to all of this? Like, this is clearly not satanic, y'all. Like, it's not, rock music is not satanic. I have not been possessed by Satan. I have not summoned any demons, like, to my knowledge. Like, and it's easy for me to fall into that but neglect, because again, I do, like I said before, I do believe in there's a spiritual reality outside of myself that involves forces for good and forces for evil. What that actually looks like and how that plays out is speculation. The Bible does not go into the huge details about how spiritual warfare works necessarily. There's not a manual for like, here's what you do. Here's the ritual you do to stop the demons, you know.
I mean, there's for Catholics, but well,
that's true. That's true. I'm not Catholic. So. I'm almost Catholic. No. I get frustrated with the fundy, quote unquote, you know, Christians who do freak out about everything. It's like, oh my gosh, Satan's in the Disney movies, Satan's in the Harry Potter, Satan's in Dungeons and Dragons. You know, it's like, stop. Even though you think you're being super spiritual and hyper aware of the spiritual realities, what you're actually doing is diminishing those in the minds of everybody else. Because then, like you said, Anika, like when you have people who go, okay, those weirdos over there, they say like Satan's in Dungeons and Dragons, but I play Dungeons and Dragons and I haven't been possessed by a demon. So clearly they don't know what they're talking about. That just destroys all credibility. And it makes those people less likely to take you seriously if, like you said, in fact, there is like a situation that comes up that is very real and, you know, a real confrontation between good and evil. And so, I think that's why I get so frustrated with that sort of like satanic panic, even though it's clearly lessened now. Like, you don't have people running around. Right. I mean, most people don't run around going Satan's in Dungeons and Dragons, you know. You might still have some people who do. I don't know. As a Christian, I do take seriously those spiritual realities and the movements of God, his angels, the Holy Spirit, you know, all of that. And that there is a war being fought that we can't always see. And so rather than focusing on that, we're worried about whether or not, you know, we saw the shadow of a demon underneath a Harry Potter book or something, you know, it's just super frustrating. And so it is very easy to kind of, you know, fall into the trap of let's make fun of those weird like Christians over there. Can you believe that person couldn't watch Disney movies when they were growing up, you know? Like, no offense, Anika. You know, I know you couldn't watch Disney movies growing up. or the Smurfs. It was the Smurfs you couldn't watch. Or could you watch Disney movies too? I don't know.
There was a time period when I couldn't watch Disney movies, and then we all got over it at some point, and then it was okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It was like that with me with
yeah.
Harry Potter as well.
Oh, nice.
When Harry Potter first came out, it was super controversial among Christians.
Yeah.
And I think there's some residual stuff with that. Like, my kid's school, I don't think does Harry Potter, but it's more like we don't want to offend some parents, not rather than like making a stand against, but like schools were like making a stand against Harry Potter back in the day, and churches too. And I remember kind of adopting that as well up until I took a fantasy literature class in college. And I was like, well, I have to read it for class anyway. And then I was like, oh, this is really fun. On a certain level, I don't care. So I'm just going to read it.
I can't remember. Have I told my Harry Potter story on the podcast before? I cannot remember. Okay. So yeah, when Harry Potter first came out, I was the ripe age to start reading those books. All of my friends were reading them. I remember writing with some friends of ours. I went to a public school growing up, not a private Christian school, but hence why all my friends were reading them, Harry Potter. So, but their kids went to a private Christian school. And I just mentioned casually one day, like, oh, I think I'm going to pick up these Harry Potter books or whatever. And what I got in response was a newsletter from their school librarian about why they would not be putting the Harry Potter books in their school library. So I read it. And again, recall that I said I was a very impressionable and sensitive child. So basically I read this whole thing, and it was going on and on about how, like, if you read Harry Potter, you open yourself up to the demonic, and there are characters in this book that drink blood and like do awful, terrible, evil things. And of course, reading this, I was like, oh my gosh, I don't want to read those books. I don't want to open myself up to Satan. Like, I didn't read Harry Potter for a really long time. And all my friends, they wouldn't like make fun of me, but it was kind of like a weird, like, why don't you like want to read these? Like, you love fantasy books. Like, I've seen you read other fantasy books. Why don't you read these? And it was just like, no, I'm not. Until I can't remember. We had moved to Alabama at that point. I think I was like in ninth grade at this point. And my parents came to me one day and they were like, hey, can you read this book? It's called Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, because your brother wants to read them. He's 6 years younger than I am. So he's like, your brother wants to read them, and we just want to make sure there's nothing weird in here. Can you read it for us?
That's so sweet.
I know. No, it really, I love that they did that. That's really nice that they didn't just go like, oh, Harry Potter, I've heard about this, Yeah. And I remember at first being like, oh my gosh, it's going to happen. Like, I'm going to touch the book and like,
it's like the Necronomicon.
Yeah. No, open it and read from it. And then I'm just going to be, needless to say, that didn't happen. And I thoroughly enjoyed the book. And I got to the end of it and I was like, oh, there's nothing bad in there. And the part where it's like, no, like Voldemort is the one who drinks the unicorn blood. Like, that's what she was referencing about characters drinking blood or whatever and like performing weird rituals. And I was like, no. Voldemort drinks unicorn blood. And literally every character in the book was like, do not do this. Like, this is bad. He's doing bad, evil things. Do not drink blood,
Do
and
not
so
drink
it's like,
unicorn blood.
Right. You are now cursed and don't do it, And so I just remember getting to the end of the book and feeling very like, I don't know if betrayed is the right word, but just like bamboozled, maybe. I don't know. Like, what? I could have been reading these the whole time with my friends and having a good time.
You're like
and
Sally
now I've
in
moved.
the pumpkin patch.
Yeah, right. But yeah, so I think that's another reason why I'm just super frustrated with people who are freak out about whatever the latest pop culture thing is, and it must have Satan in it.
I wonder sometimes if we're not like all reacting against, I mean, there's really no other way to do it, right? We're reacting against past versions of whatever the other side was saying 10 years ago. Now that it's like manifestly stupid, we're like, oh, look at the way they are, and it's like, well, some are probably still that way. The ones that are like pretty behind the times and whatever their group is
hidden in some place far from power where you're never going to hear from them.
Where it's really not gonna, although it is disturbing to me to hear that at some of the highest levels of our judicial system, the Hellfire Club has penetrated. But,
I mean, I think it all comes out. Ultimately, it's not really about D&D or rock music or what Harry Potter or whatever. What it's about is like a combination of fear of the unknown. We don't understand this thing. It seems weird to us. We're going to assume that there are bad things happening over there because it's weird and it's not explicitly Christian, you know,
Right.
even though there are like trying to explain to somebody like, oh, but like Harry Potter actually has a lot of like Christian themes of like self-sacrifice, friendship, love, you know, the power of love, all that stuff. Like that's very Christian. But you can't explain that to some people. It's all they hear is School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and they're like, occult. Right. This is the cult.
Well, and going back to what we talked about earlier, there's also that there's a need to find evil and to find a reason for the way things are breaking down, and to have the scapegoat, to have the outsider, to have the here's the nefarious plan, and the reason why we can't have nice things is
well, and it also stops, like you said, it is a scapegoat because it stops us from self-examining, realizing that I always forget who said the quote, but the about the line between good and evil running through the heart of every human being.
Solzhenitsyn.
Yes, that's it.
That's right.
Solzhenitsyn. Like it keeps us from recognizing that because it's easier to put people into camps and say, oh, those people doing Dungeons and Dragons or reading Harry Potter over there are clearly evil, and we're in the good camp over here and we have to stop them. And I think that's more what the Stranger Things is drawing on. It's that like fear mongering. It's not so much about like, oh, this is how I think this actually happened. It's more a commentary. And honestly, it's more of a commentary on what's happening right now in our present day of like, very much like fear mongering, misinformation.
Right.
People don't actually like want to sit down and understand what's happening. They're like, we want to fix whatever's going on, whatever we see is the problem, whichever side you're on. You know, we see X as the problem. So what we're going to do is we're going to do this to fix it.
Also, forgetting that the good and evil runs through the heart of every person, right? And that's one of the reasons that I think Charles Williams' approach to the invisible world is in a lot of ways superior to the... I've never read Peretti, so I can't say him.
Oh, it's vastly superior.
You've never read Peretti?
I've never read Peretti.
Not even Cooper Family Adventure series?
Not even Cooper Family Adventure
Listen, you
series.
can't call yourself a 90s Christian.
Christian.
You haven't read.
Exactly.
I guess I'm just not. I'm more of a 80s Christian. I don't know. It's hard because drama is external and humans are attracted to drama. And we like to, even in like Stranger Things, they're not like sitting around and like conducting like psychology sessions the whole time, you know, and talking about like, okay, well, tell me about your growing up, and let's try to suss out. I mean, there is some like internal stuff that gets worked out, but for the most part, the conflict is out there because that's how fiction works. And that's what we connect to as kind of tribal beings, right?
It's very archetypal. I mean, it's like, this is Vecna represents evil. Like, this is what we have to go defeat. And I think what makes it so clever from a Stranger Things perspective is that it's like, yes, Vecna is an external threat, but he's also internal at the same time because he is like a real being, like a human. He exists. He's not just in your mind, but he's also in your mind. That makes it more interesting. It makes him more interesting than just like, oh, look, here's yet another stereotypical dark wizard. We got to go defeat him. You know, it's like, it is like psychological. Like, I wouldn't go so far as to call it like, you know, this is very deep, like super artsy, like, you know, psychological analysis of the human heart or whatever, but it kind of is. Like, especially in the context of like Max and her struggle, it definitely gets more psychological. So I think that helps because it's like it's simultaneously an archetypal external threat and also an internal threat, because the only reason that people are even vulnerable to Vecna, it's not like Vecna can just invade anybody's mind. It's like you have to have gone through some trauma. You've got to be like closed off to people. And that's what makes you vulnerable to Vecna. And so I think that kind of helps in a way solidify that. It gives us as the audience that like, oh yes, we have to go fight the threat. You know, we want the heroes to go fight the external threat, but also recognizes that humans are complicated beings and have internal conflict as well as an external conflict.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, scripture is very clear, resist the devil and he will flee from you, right? I think Williams does that well in a way that a lot of the fringier, as much as I love them, as much as I enjoyed being, like, going on prayer walks and praying against this stronghold or whatever else, and like pretending like I could see things and, in the air or whatever else, like that's really appealing to this kind of dramatic urge that we have, right? Yeah. But the way Williams demonstrates it, kind of dramatizes it, is, and this is probably partly why Williams is so hard to read, it's almost entirely you resist evil, right? Yep. That's your job. That's what you do, because it's inside you as much as it's inside anyone else. As much as it's like over that building over there, it's it's tempting you. You resist that, and
you receive the grace.
Yes. And you receive the grace, and that's doing all kinds of things that you don't know about, and you're not privy to, frankly, and you shouldn't be. But we want life to be more like Stranger Things than like a Charles Williams novel, right? Or like Lord of the Rings than like a Charles Williams novel, right? Where we could see the evil, and we're like really obviously good, and we can like throw a bunch of Molotov cocktails at it and make it explode.
I mean, okay, I want to defend Lord of the Rings just for a moment, because as you're talking about all you do is resist the evil and you receive the grace. In Lord of the Rings, we're not supposed to identify with Aragorn.
That's right.
We are not Gandalf.
Mm-hmm.
We are, maybe some people are called to be Frodo and to walk in, but most likely in that case, you're a Sam and you're just like watching. Yeah. But most of us are Merry and Pippin and caught up in a story we don't understand and messing up and are making wrong choices, not even knowing why we do what we do and why we pick up stones that get us in trouble and expose the people we love and move all these crazy things with wizards, and we didn't know, but now because of what we did, things are in a mess. And we're in a mess. And it's by grace that mess is worked out as a eucatastrophe, and God uses all our messes as eucatastrophe. And I think there is something about, there is that a lot of what we're called to, is that helpless trust, but sometimes you do get caught up in a story much bigger than you expected, and with actual villains and actual monsters. And when that comes, to know that you can trust the author of the story, to know that your job is to resist, but that might look like being screamed at by a witch king and stabbed in the shoulder or whatever it is. I think there is something to the dramatization, because there are great events in the world. I'm rejoicing in answered prayers of the last 50 years and prayers that my now dead mother, I know, prayed right this year. And that feels like a monumental victory on the level of, oh my goodness, the orcs are retreating and I didn't know Gandalf was going to come. Right. And I think there's something really okay about acknowledging the greater world events as well as our own internal resistance to evil.
It's not an either or, I think, because there, like we've been saying, there is an external evil, but also an internal evil. And so I think, to me, like Lord of the Rings captures that pretty perfectly, because there is that obviously external narrative of, okay, we got to beat Sauron, like, and we got to go destroy the ring, like that's the goal. But also you have things like the Frodo's internal struggle to not be overtaken by the ring, or Aragorn resisting temptation, Boromir succumbing to temptation. It's like you still have these internal this internal character drama on top of the external character drama. And so I think that's part of what makes Lord of the Rings so enduring. And so while, like, yes, as much as I love Charles Williams, I think that partially explains why he has never reached the same level of popularity as a Lewis or a Tolkien, because while his ideas and his writing are brilliant and there's like a depth to them that's just beautiful, it's like in this internal but like spiritual realm where it's like there's not, like in a Williams novel you don't have, oh, there's a dragon, go fight it, we got to go defeat the dragon, and so that it's harder to like put that into novel form because so much of a novel is like characterization, like what are the characters doing but also experiencing, and like there is an element of what are the characters are doing in Williams, but it's not always obvious, especially when you have pages and pages and pages of internal, like, let me go off on a lovely description of what's happening inside of you, or like that's why, like, I'm super understanding of people who read Williams and are like, I have no idea what this is and I don't know what to do with it, so I'm just going to move on and go back to Lord of the Rings. I'm like, I get it, I think Lord of the Rings is a perfect example of what Stranger Things is doing, especially in season 4. And so obviously the Tolkien influences run all over the place, but
yeah, I mean the Tolkien thing, it definitely lines up with, and they even reference it, in season 4,
Yeah. Oh, Steve.
But it lines up with. For people who are little people going out into this scary world and trying to tangle with things they have no business tangling with.
Yep.
The thing that keeps them safe in Stranger Things, at least, seems to mostly be luck. The thing that keeps them safe in Lord of the Rings is luck, but luck theologically conceived as providence, right?
Yeah.
But I think the difference is, and I think this is partly why Lord of the Rings is still more, it feels truer to me anyway, is that, as you were saying, Anika, we're meant to sympathize with the hobbits, and we're meant to sympathize with the hobbits who don't do anything really. They save the world, but they save the world by kind of screwing up and not having these great, heroic actions, maybe with the exception of Sam, right? It's really putting one foot in front of the other, going to a place where you don't enjoy the way things are there, right? And buggering on, right? Until you get to where you're supposed to get, and continuing to resist. Finally you get there and you screw up anyway, but, but it's still used, right? And because there's still grace, right?
Yeah.
That does correspond to the idea, I think, the primary battle, right, being a spiritual battle that you can't see, right, as opposed to a spiritual battle where you can give spiritual designations to things in the world out there, right? As both the clique of basketball players turned vigilantes and the heroes do in Stranger Things, and we need that as people who are watching TV, right? It wouldn't work otherwise, right? But the neat thing about what Tolkien does is you have that with Tolkien, but really what makes the true difference is just the little people doing the ordinary things that are no fun, right? And like the part with the journey to Mordor, that's the least fun part to read in Lord of the Rings, but it's the most important part, right? I don't really enjoy reading about, and everything looked really bad, and there was no beauty, and I mean, it must just come from, I think, probably partly not only Tolkien's faith, but Tolkien's actual experience of war, right? That is how things are won. They're boring, right? Like a lot of times you have to wade through a lot of boring stuff to overcome. I think also Lewis in the Screwtape Letters, when he's talking about the war, Screwtape acknowledges that, like, of course the war matters, but like how exactly it matters, that's not even for us to decide at this level of temptership, right? That's for spirits much further down in the lowerarchy to decide. What mainly matters about the war is what it does to your patient, how it affects his standing with the enemy, whether he's practicing charity toward other people, whether he's doing his duty even, right? And his war duties, right? But doing them well without complaint and showcasing like kind of the fruits of the spirit in his behavior, right? There's kind of an upside down inversion of what we think is important when it comes to winning things, having any kind of victory. I don't know, in a world right now that people are so used to pointing at the other side and saying, oh, they're the evil ones, we're the goodies, we just need to impose our will upon them. Saying instead, no, we need to like tend our garden and live our lives well in accordance with our faith, and maybe unplug from the extraordinarily dramatic landscape that the news paints for us on an hourly basis. Just sort of live as we've been commanded to live, even though it's not sexy, and even though it might not be very metal either, but maybe occasionally it will.
Well, and even then, at the end of the journey in Lord of the Rings, you still had to go back and have the cleansing, the scouring of the Shire.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It was petty and smaller. Like the evil was to scale of the Shire. It wasn't to scale of the great epic, but it had still infiltrated and needed to be resisted, and that looked very different in Hobbit terms than it did in great grand scales.
So let's end with some predictions. What do you think is going to happen in the final season of Stranger Things?
Oh man, the kids will win. somehow.
I was hoping.
Because here's the thing, like about Stranger Things too, is that like yes, it's very like dark and they have horror elements in it, but at the same time, it's like it's a different show from like a Game of Thrones or something where it's like, oh, it's super bleak and you know everybody's dead, you know, and it's I mean, again, it depends on your taste, I guess, but like I prefer Stranger Things over something like a Game of Thrones. Like even if like an actual major character ends up dying at the end of season 5 or something, like it doesn't have quite the same like feel as like a bleak, there's no hope and I'm super cynical kind of show. It's very hopeful and optimistic, even when things look really bad. So like as cool as the end of season 4 was with slow-mo Nancy shooting that guy up,
Yes.
I was like, yes, girl. And Robin, I love Robin. As cool as that was, I do hope they maybe subvert those expectations a little bit of like, all right, here's the big evil, let's go blow him up. It would be nice to see something a little more either subtle or I don't know, just something different. There are fan theories floating around that Eddie's not dead. He's going to come back.
Oh.
I don't know how much of that is like based on anything or if it's just like hope because everybody loves Eddie.
Wishful.
Yeah,
I mean,
wishful.
Someone has to die every series. I mean, the Sean Astin character, that was heartbreaking.
Alexi from season 3.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But basically the pattern now is any new character they introduce in a season that everybody loves, they're dead. They're marked for death. Okay.
Yep.
So that's kind of why I wasn't really like, I was sad that Eddie died, but I was not like, oh no, Eddie's dead. I was like, here it is. Especially with all the talk of like him being like, we're not heroes. I'm like, he's dead.
Yeah.
They're gonna kill him.
He's a red shirt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Honestly, though, I was really afraid they were going to kill Steve because
I thought that too.
All the whole monologue about like, I just have a dream about renting a Winnebago and driving across country with my 6 kids, and I'm like, oh no, they're going to kill Steve.
If this were a war movie,
yeah.
in your head right now.
He's dead. But they did not do that. So I don't know. And at this point, I'm like, listen, Steve has made it through 4 seasons. Please let him just make it through all 5 seasons.
I don't know. I don't know if that Winnebago dream is going to come true.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I trust that the Duffer brothers know what they're doing and that they'll do it. Whatever it is they're going to do is going to be fine. It'll be entertaining. I'm not looking for Stranger Things to be some like I said, deep philosophical, like artsy piece of television,
Right.
But I think it's good. It's quality. It's fun. Yes, we could argue about like plot holes and what characters are, like as you can do with anything. Yeah. You can say like, this is a plot hole. Why did they do it this way? It's like, but to me that just takes away from the fun of the show. It's been a long time since I've sat down and watched a new show and just been immediately sucked in and been like, I have to see where this goes, I'm here for the ride,
It's the closest thing we get to mainstream pop culture these days. Just a show that's so popular and well done that everybody knows about it. Gosh.
Do you have predictions, Chris or Anika?
I think the Russians are coming back. Yeah. And I think
Red Dawn. Red Dawn.
Oh man. It is going to be the Russians in Hawkins using whatever the particle, whatever field in there.
Upside down particle stuff. Yeah.
Their army of monsters are going to haunt everybody, maybe through some sort of portal. I also think that's going to be used as like the naturalistic explanation for some sort of Russian experiments also are at play in creating the upside down. And maybe it's like nuclear stuff. But there will be a scientific explanation at bottom at the end.
Indeed. So I think it sounds like, at least from what I heard, there's going to be a time jump, which makes sense because the cast will have aged a bit more.
Although I'll be interested to see how they do that, because where they left season 4, how do you jump ahead 2 years from that?
So I'll tell you how I see them doing it.
Okay.
So things have been really bad in Hawkins for a long time. And they live by the skin of their teeth, being all scrappy and whatnot. And it's kind of an escape from New York situation where they, constantly have to dodge things from the upside down and whatever else. And then finally they figure out how to take out Vecna and they go to do it. And they do, but it costs them enormously. And then it's all over. That's what I think they'll draw on like all of these 80s movies where it's this dystopian city in the future, essentially anarchic, right? And maybe it'll be even kind of like humans are just as bad as the creatures from the Upside Down sort of thing. There's essentially this anarchic state that nobody can get into or out of because the government will have sealed up Hawkins, right?
I like that.
Yeah.
And then they are essentially all just like freedom fighting until there's a big explosion and Vecna's no more. So that's my guess.
Do we think that Elle survives the final confrontation with Vecna? Because I could see that going both ways. I could see them killing her off, but also not,
I do not think they'll kill her off.
Yeah.
They very well may kill Steve off, but I don't think they'll kill
No,
her.
don't say that. Don't speak that into existence, Chris.
Yeah. Because Steve's just been... that was their plan for Steve in the first place anyway. Better for him to die a hero, and that resolves the love triangle.
No! Kill Jonathan! Jonathan's so dumb.
Please
he
take
just gets
Jonathan.
high all the time.
Yeah.
Man, I did think Stranger Things did a great job showing how drugs cuts you off from people who need you.
Yeah.
Like actually the Jonathan Will arc where he realizes how he wasn't there and how lonely his brother is. It was like, oh, I really appreciated that. That was good.
Here's what I could see them doing with Jonathan. They like underdeveloped him for most of the season, right?
Yeah.
And he just gets high all the time. He could rise to greatness in Henry V sort of fashion, wherein
he ditches his high friend who gets in trouble all the time. That's the Falstaff. Yeah.
He ditches Falstaff, who he's always just getting drunk with, right?
Yep.
And finally becomes the person he was always meant to be after he's put away these getting high or getting drunk or whatever else, and leads them into battle, and they have kind of a St. Crispin's Day moment.
Yes.
And whatever else.
I think that could happen, but not in getting rid of, as in what do you call it? The renouncing, not renouncing.
Right. He's not going to renounce Argyle.
No, but I think Argyle is going to go back and find Susie's sister in Utah. There's going to be something bringing them back to Utah with Susie and her sister and all the Mormons. It's going to be great.
So I've got to say that was my favorite part of the
was so awesome.
of the whole season. That they build it up as like these are going to be these creepy, overly religious, staid, placid
and they're
Mormons.
Like,
they guard the houses just like any other big family,
Yep.
I thought that was
only
fantastic.
Creative and the kids are all doing awesome stuff.
But I thought that was awesome. That was just one of the greatest moments. All right, well, we have been talking for a long time. This has been Inklings Variety Hours. So
It's been a long time since we've all gotten together.
It definitely has. It definitely has. And it's been wonderful to talk with the two of you again. Listeners, we hope you enjoyed this. And I'm sure you can find better commentary on Stranger Things out there.
No.
Never. Nowhere.
But Stranger Things paired with
plus Inklings,
deep knowledge of Inklings works, you're going to be hard pressed to find that somewhere else. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you all next time. And Meagan or Anika, would you like to say anything? Any last thing?
No, we were just going to say here, we were done.
I didn't want to just cut you off.
Spoke for us.
I know, apparently. Just tell me before I die that I did the right thing.
I wasn't going to say anything, but you were like, okay, I'll see you next time. And it's like, what if the rest of us get together to talk about more Stranger Things or something else? I don't know.
Please do.
We could have another D&D episode. I could talk for a while about D&D.
Finish up Princess and the Goblin.
Is that? Oh, I thought y'all had finished that already.
No, we're still working on it. You know how it is. You know how it is.
That's true.
I slow everything down because I want to read and comment on everything. Page.
Yeah, well, me too. That's the mark of a good reader. All right. Any like catchphrase you all want to sign off with or anything like that?
Resist the devil and he will flee.
Yeah.
That's not really my catchphrase, but I felt like it was a good lesson.
What's the Argyle song that they play in the band all the time? Pass the
Duchy.
Pass the dutchie on the left hand side. Pass the dutchie on the left hand side. It a go bun. Give me the music, make me jump and prance. It a go
Right.
Is it Pass the Duchy? Because that's from a Beck song.
No, it's the
Or is it something else? From the left-hand side. Yeah.
It's on the Wedding Singer soundtrack.
Yeah. Okay. So, that could be a good catchphrase that you could sign off with. For somebody.
No, I'm not signing off.
We're not signing off with that.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming on and talking with me about Stranger Things. I hope we can do this again soon. And,
Yeah.
It's just been great.
Yeah.
Yay.
All right. And listeners, thank you. See you around.
All blessed encounter full of joy, unscheduled on a decent plan, with here an addict of Tolkien, there a Charles Williams fan.
I say you're asking me to follow you into Mordor, which, if I'm totally straight with you, I think it's a really bad idea. But, the Shire is burning, so Mordor it is. What is Mordor?